In 1900, the world had not yet witnessed a world war. It still didn't know what a famous serial killer was, and there was no television to broadcast horror in real time. And even so, humans were already capable of surpassing themselves in cruelty. The first decade of the 20th century began with a crime that mixed obsession, money, and cold calculation at a level that shocked even the standards of that era. Harry Kendall Thaw was the heir to a massive American fortune, and he was married to Evelyn Nesbit, one of the most famous and photographed women in the United States at the turn of the century. The problem was Stanford White, a brilliant architect and influential figure, and Evelyn's former lover before her marriage. Thaw was consumed by obsession over his wife's past and the man she had once cared for. In June of 1906, inside a crowded theater in New York, Thaw walked across the room and confronted Stanford White. With hundreds of people watching, he fired 3 shots. He didn't run. He remained standing, the weapon still in his hand, while chaos erupted around him. The trial that followed became known as the first trial of the century, covered by newspapers around the world, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse every day. Thaw's defense claimed temporary insanity caused by jealousy, a new argument at the time that his lawyers called red madness. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital, escaped, was captured again, and eventually released. He lived until the age of 76. Evelyn Nesbit spent the rest of her life trying to escape the shadow of the case. In the 1910s, the crime that captured global attention did not take place in a dark alley or a crowded theater. Instead, it unfolded in a more sophisticated way, marking the first time in history that the telegraph was used to capture a fugitive criminal. Hawley Harvey Crippen was an American doctor living in London with his wife, Cora, a frustrated and controlling opera singer. In January 1910, Cora disappeared. Crippen claimed she had returned to the United States and died there. Few believed him, but without evidence, the police had no way to act. Weeks later, investigators found human remains in Crippen's garden, only a torso. Forensic analysis detected scopolamine in the tissue, a sedative Crippen had access to as a doctor. The remains were identified as Cora's. But Crippen had already fled. He boarded a ship for Canada in disguise, bringing his companion with him, also disguised. The ship's captain grew suspicious and sent a telegram to Scotland Yard describing the passengers. A detective boarded a faster ship, reached Canada before Crippen, and arrested him at the port. It was the first criminal capture in history using wireless communication, followed in real time by newspapers worldwide. Crippen was executed in November 1910. The 1920s brought organized crime, prohibition, and gang-related violence to the streets of major American cities. But the crime that defined the decade wasn't a gang battle. It was a carefully planned operation, carried out with near-military precision and still studied today as an example of organized execution. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day, Chicago. 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang were summoned to a warehouse on North Clark Street, supposedly to receive a shipment of smuggled whiskey. What arrived instead were 2 men dressed as police officers and 2 in civilian clothes. They ordered everyone to face the wall. The 7 men were shot using Thompson submachine guns. More than 70 rounds were fired. The only survivor was a dog tied in the corner of the warehouse. Al Capone was never formally charged. He was in Miami with an airtight alibi. Bugs Moran, the main target, had arrived late and saw the fake officers entering the warehouse. He stayed outside and survived by chance. The St. Valentine's Day massacre marked the moment the world realized that American organized crime had evolved into something different. No longer just street gangs, but structured organizations with strategy and the capability to carry out military-style operations in the middle of a city. The 1930s were the decade in which crime stopped being an individual act and became a tool of state policy. But within that larger context, there was one specific case that captured the world's attention in 1932, before the war overshadowed everything. Charles Lindbergh was the most famous man on Earth. The first to cross the Atlantic in a solo flight, an American national hero, the face of an entire generation. In March 1932, his 20-month-old son was taken from the second-floor bedroom of the family's home in New Jersey. Investigators found an improvised ladder by the window and a ransom note demanding $50,000. The money was paid, but the child was not returned. 2 months later, the body was discovered a short distance from the house. Evidence indicated the child had died on the night of the abduction, likely due to an accident during the entry. 2 years of investigation led authorities to Bruno Hauptmann, a German immigrant who worked as a carpenter. Wood from the ladder was traced back to boards from his own attic, and part of the ransom money was found hidden in his garage. Hauptmann maintained his innocence to the end. He was executed in the electric chair in 1936. The case resulted in the creation of a federal law in the United States that made kidnapping a federal crime still known today as the Lindbergh Law. Speaking about the most shocking crime of the 1940s requires honesty about scale. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazi regime, remains the largest organized crime in human history. But within that decade, there was a specific case that illustrates how individual cruelty operated within the larger system. Irma Grieche was 19 when she became a supervisor at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. She became known among prisoners as the Blonde Angel, young, striking, and feared for her authority and brutality. Survivor testimonies described arbitrary selections, harsh beatings, and her involvement in procedures carried out with disturbing ease. Captured by British forces in 1945 at just 22, she was tried at the Nuremberg proceedings and sentenced to death. On the morning of her execution, she asked not to be blindfolded. When the executioner asked for her final words, she said only "schnell," meaning quickly in German. She was executed in December 1945, becoming the youngest war criminal put to death by the Allies. She was 22. The 1950s were the decade of appearances post-war America, with new suburbs, big cars, and televisions in every living room. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Ed Gein lived on an isolated farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, known to neighbors as a quiet, helpful man who occasionally watched their children. When police entered his farm in November 1957 while investigating a local woman's disappearance, they discovered evidence unlike anything previously recorded in American criminal history. Investigators found items crafted from human remains, revealing a disturbing pattern of behavior. Among the evidence was a makeshift costume assembled from parts of bodies, which Gein used during solitary nighttime rituals as he imagined becoming his deceased mother. Most of the remains did not come from people he had killed, but from graves he had secretly disturbed. However, at least 2 women were confirmed victims of homicide directly attributed to him. Gein was declared insane and never faced a formal trial. He died in a psychiatric hospital in 1984. But his cultural impact was permanent. He became the direct inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, and Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The 1960s had the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War, and Martin Luther King. But the crime that defined the end of the decade and shattered the innocence of the hippie generation took place in a house on Cielo Drive, Los Angeles, on the night of August 8th to 9th, 1969. Sharon Tate was an actress, 26 years old and 8 months pregnant. That night, she was at home with 4 friends. Members of the Manson family, a cult led by Charles Manson, who lived on a ranch outside Los Angeles, entered the house and killed all 5 of them. On the wall, written in blood, was the word "pig." The following night, the group attacked a second house and killed 2 more people. Manson never carried out the murders himself, but he directed his followers with total control. Young people, mostly women, whom he had manipulated for years using drugs, isolation, and a blend of hippie philosophy with racial doom beliefs. The Manson murders are seen as the moment America realized the utopia of the 1960s was over. Woodstock had taken place just 3 weeks earlier. New York in the 1970s was a city in collapsed street crime, municipal bankruptcy, blackouts, strikes. And in the summer of 1977, a gunman was attacking couples in parked cars across the city, using a .44 revolver and leaving letters for the police signed "Son of Sam." David Berkowitz killed 6 people and injured 7 between 1976 and 1977. But the number of victims wasn't what created the terror. It was the randomness of the attacks. Any couple parked on a dark street could be next. Hair salons reported a drop in customers because the victims tended to have long, dark hair, and many women began cutting their hair out of fear. The letters he left for the police were articulate, unsettling, and filled with strange references. He created a persona, and the New York press amplified every detail. He was captured in August 1977 because of a parking ticket near one of the crime scenes. When officers arrived at his home, they found the walls covered in writings. Berkowitz said his neighbor had a dog that he believed was possessed and commanding him to act. He remains in prison and repeatedly refuses parole, saying he deserves to stay incarcerated. The 1980s had Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. But Jeffrey Dahmer, who began killing in 1978 and was arrested in 1991, operated throughout the decade undetected from an apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 17 victims, young men, most of them black. Dahmer lured them to his apartment, drugged them, and killed them, followed by actions described in court records in a way that remains difficult to process even today. These records include attempts to create living zombies through improvised procedures and the keeping of body parts. What makes Dahmer's case particularly striking is how deeply the system failed. In May 1991, one of his victims, a 14-year-old boy, escaped into the street disoriented. Neighbors called the police. 2 officers arrived and spoke with Dahmer, believed his claim that it was a dispute between partners, and returned the boy to the apartment where he died hours later. Dahmer was finally captured when another victim escaped while handcuffed and flagged down a patrol car. Inside the apartment, police discovered preserved remains and evidence of Dahmer's crimes. He was killed in prison in 1994. The 1990s had O.J. Simpson and, at the end of the decade, Columbine. But the crime that redefined what was possible on American soil happened on the morning of April 19, 1995 in Oklahoma City. Timothy McVeigh was a U.S. Army veteran, decorated from the Gulf War, who had developed a deep resentment toward the federal government. At 9:02 a.m., he parked a truck carrying more than 2 tons of improvised explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building and detonated it. 168 people were killed, including 19 children who were in a daycare center inside the building. More than 600 others were injured. Half of the 9-story building's facade was destroyed. For hours, the FBI believed it was an attack by foreign terrorists. McVeigh White, American, ex-military, and decorated, was stopped 90 minutes later in a routine traffic stop because he was driving without a license plate. He claimed the attack was retaliation for the government incidents at Waco and Ruby Ridge. He was executed by lethal injection in 2001. He was 33 years old and expressed no remorse.